Tonight's lecture is over ecosystems and nutrient cycling. On September 26, 1993, with their first mission complete, 4 men and 4 women emerged from Biosphere 2. A hulking dome of custom-made glass and steel, they made their way back into the Arizona desert, where throngs of spectators stood cheering. They had been sealed inside the facility along with 3,000 other plant and animal species for exactly 2 years and 20 minutes. It was the longest anyone had ever survived in an enclosed structure. The feat was part of a grand experiment with 2 main goals. First, scientists hoped that by studying this mini Earth, which could be controlled and manipulated in ways that the real Earth could not, they might better understand our own planet's delicate balance and how to best protect it. Second, they wanted to create an entirely self-contained enclosure that could sustain life, the kind that might one day be used to colonize the Moon or Mars. By the time the Biospherians emerged from the structure, they had learned a lot about the complexities of our ecosystems. One of the key lessons was the realization that the Earth's natural and self-sustaining ecosystems were much harder to replicate than they had hoped. More than 1/3 of the flora and fauna had gone extinct, including most of the vertebrates and all of the pollinating insects. Morning glory vines had overrun food crops, cockroaches and ants were thriving, and eating too many sweet potatoes had turned the Biospherians themselves bright orange. A string of plant diseases had decimated other crops. On top of that, nitrous oxide, commonly known as laughing gas, had grown concentrated enough to reduce vitamin B12 synthesis to a level that could impair or damage the brain, according to one interim report. And oxygen levels had plummeted from 21% to 14%, just barely enough to sustain human life. Project engineers had been forced to pump in outside air, violating the facility's sanctity as a closed system in order to ensure adequate oxygen levels. To be sure, the 8 Biospherians had survived, and the facility still held enormous potential as a scientific tool, an opportunity to conduct experiments on ecosystem scales. In a recent memoir, Biospherian Mark Nelson points out that humans are already conducting quote-unquote unplanned planetary experiments as we release pollutants and extract resources at record rates. What happens when tens of thousands of new synthetic chemicals produced in vast quantities are introduced into the basic air, water, food, and soil cycles, Nelson asks. This small replica of Earth would be a far better place to test the environmental impacts of our actions than our own life support system. But would it work? Could we create a functioning biosphere on our own? In order to answer that question, we need to answer a few others first. What exactly is a biosphere, and just how did Biosphere 2's creators set about building one? And that brings us to our key concept number 1. Ecologists identify a nesting organization of life from individuals to the biosphere, often focusing on the levels of population, community, and ecosystem to examine how species respond to and affect the natural world. So let's first check out infographic number 1 on page 45. Ecologists recognize a nesting hierarchy of organization from the biosphere down to the individual organism. Each category is made up of one of the smaller ones. So you can see on this infographic, if we start with the individual, that leads us to a population. And then from a population, we're led into a community. From a community, we're led into an ecosystem. From an ecosystem to a biome, and then biomes make up the biosphere. The field of ecology focuses on how species interact with other components in their environment. In other words, it is all about relationships. These relationships can be examined at different levels. So the term biosphere refers to the total area on Earth where living things are found. Also, the sum total of all its biomes, that is, regions identified by their distinctive collection of vegetation, and an ecosystem includes all the organisms in a given area, the biotic components, in addition to the non-living abiotic components, or components of the physical environment in which they interact, things like wind, rain, sunlight, etc. In the natural world, ecosystems assume a range of shapes and sizes. A single simple tide pool qualifies as an ecosystem, so does the Mojave Desert. So having the entire biosphere as the focus of study is usually too expansive to manage. So some ecologists study how ecosystems function by focusing on interactions between individuals of the same species within a population. For example, the wolves of the Northern Rockies and Yellowstone National Park make up one population there. The elk make up a different population, as do the bison, the beaver, and the willow trees. So it is important to note that these populations don't exist in isolation. Each population interacts with the other species around it. When ecologists study the collection of populations that live together and interact with a given area, they are focusing on the ecological community. Unfortunately, populations in an ecological community must deal with human actions that alter their ecosystems and disrupt vital connections. For example, human development of the Everglades has affected that entire community by altering water cycles, changing the availability of nutrients and resources for every population in the ecosystem, and changing the way that they interact with each other. And that brings us to our key concept number 2. A constant input of energy is always needed because once it is used by one organism, it cannot be reused by another. New inputs of matter to Earth, however, are negligible. So life also depends on the constant cycling of matter resources. So let's first talk about infographic number 2 on page 46. Energy can enter and leave Earth as light, that is solar radiation, and heat, radiation from the Earth, but matter stays in the biosphere, cycling in and out of organisms, or biomass, and environmental components. So all ecosystems function through two fundamental processes that link species with each other and with their environment: matter cycles and energy flow. Matter cycles are biogeochemical cycles that refer specifically to the movement of life's essential chemicals or nutrients through an ecosystem. Energy, on the other hand, enters ecosystems as solar radiation and is passed along from organism to organism, some released as heat, until there is no more usable energy left. So that statement is a little bit misleading because there are ecosystems on Earth that are not powered by the sun. For instance, at the bottom of the ocean, there is an ecosystem that is powered by hydrothermal vents. Earth, or Biosphere number 1, as the creators of Biosphere number 2 like to call it, is materially closed but energetically open. In other words, the living and non-living material that make up an ecosystem, called biomass, does not enter or leave the system. We get no appreciable amounts of quote-unquote new matter from space. On Earth, nutrients cycle through both biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem: organisms, air, land, and water. These nutrients are stored in abiotic or biotic parts of the environment called sinks. Organisms acquire nutrients from a sink, and those nutrients are then cycled through the food chain, eventually returning to a sink where they linger for various lengths of time, known as residence times. For example, carbon has an average residence time of about 5 years in the atmosphere, about 50 years in terrestrial soils, and more than 3,000 years in deep ocean sediments. Energy, on the other hand, does come and go. Some energy leaves as heat or light, and new energy arrives every day in the form of sunlight. Therefore, we can say that matter cycles, but energy flows in a one-way trip. So when it comes to energy, I would like for you to keep in mind these two laws of thermodynamics. First, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed. That is known as the law of conservation of energy. Secondly, in any system, there is always a net loss of energy. This is sometimes referred to as the law of entropy. And that brings us to our key concept number 3. The biome that is present in a given area is influenced by the physical and climatic characteristics of its environment, particularly precipitation amount and temperature for terrestrial biomes. So biomes are specific portions of the biosphere determined by climate and identified by the predominant vegetation and organisms adapted to live there. Biomes can be divided into 3 broad categories: terrestrial, marine, and freshwater. Within those 3 categories are several subgroups. For example, forests, deserts, and grasslands are 3 main types of terrestrial biomes. Within the forest biome category are different types of forests, such as tropical, temperate, and boreal forests. And within each of those groups are subgroups, for example, dry tropical forest and tropical rainforest. So when ecologists study the entire ecosystem, their ability to manipulate such a broad study area is limited. They usually focus on making observations and trying to discern cause and effect from those observations. This is no small challenge. Precise measurement of every relevant ecological factor is simply not possible, and even the simplest factors, such as a change in rainfall, the loss of a single species, variation in solar radiation reaching the ground, can impact many of the other factors and affect the ecosystem as a whole. But this doesn't mean we can't gain insights from ecosystem scale studies. Scientists measure important parameters of natural ecosystems to gather evidence to try to determine cause and effect. They often compare these that are affected by natural disasters or human impact to less disturbed ecosystems in a kind of quote-unquote natural experiment. From this, ecologists make their best estimation of how multiple factors affect one another, often via mathematical modeling. The more parameters that are properly measured and linked to one another, the better, because all parameters and relationships cannot possibly be included. There may be considerable uncertainty when it comes to understanding what is happening at the ecosystem level. So Biosphere 2 offered ecologists an unprecedented research tool, a mini-planet where a variety of environmental variables, from temperature and water availability to the relative proportions of oxygen and carbon dioxide at any given moment, could be tightly controlled and precisely measured. Manipulating these variables and tracking the outcomes could greatly advance our understanding of natural ecosystems and all the minute complex interactions that make them work. The plan for Biosphere 2 was to use that knowledge to figure out how to repair degraded ecosystems in the real world so that they could continue to provide the services so essential to our survival. And that brings us to infographic number 3 on page 48. Terrestrial biomes are specific types of terrestrial ecosystems with characteristic temperature and precipitation conditions. Temperature varies with latitude, decreasing as one moves away from the equator, and altitude decreasing as elevation increases. Thus, a cold climate can be found above 60 degrees north on an equatorial mountaintop. Latitude also affects precipitation, with wet areas occurring at the equator around 60 degrees north and south, and dry areas occurring around 30 degrees north and south. That is due to global air circulation patterns. Moving on, This biome climograph shows the approximate distribution of terrestrial biomes with regard to annual precipitation and temperature. As precipitation increases and more plant life is able to be supported, deserts, scrublands, or grasslands give way to forests. The temperature also influences what type of desert, grassland, or forest is present. For example, temperate forest versus boreal forest. And this figure takes us back to page 47. Biosphere 2 houses several biomes under one roof, each contributing to overall function. One of the challenges faced by designers was how to include a variety of biomes in the close quarters of the 3-acre Biosphere 2 structure. For example, in nature, a tropical rainforest whose temperature is fairly constant would not be next to an arid desert, which drops in temperature at night. To deal with this, an ocean was placed between the desert and rainforest to serve as a temperature buffer. And that brings us to our key concept number 4. Limiting factors determine the distribution and size of populations. Variability within a population increases its range of tolerance, expanding its distribution and increasing the chance it will be able to adapt to changing conditions. So planning each biome of Biosphere 2 required a mind-boggling array of considerations. Not only how diverse plant and animal species would interact within and across biomes, but also what nutrient requirements of each organism they plan to include. Termites, for example, would need enough dead wood at the beginning of the closure to sustain them until some of the larger plants began dying off. Termites live in the soil, stirring it and allowing air to penetrate soil particles. If the termites ran out of dead wood and starved to death, organisms living in the soil would not get enough oxygen and the entire desert would be jeopardized. Hummingbirds, on the other hand, would need nectar-filled flowers. Try figuring out how many flowers a day a hummingbird needs. Then from there, you need to know what the blooming season is, and then what the nectar load per flower is. And then you have to translate all of that into units of hummingbird support. Now imagine doing that sort of thing about 3,000 times. Every species depends on a variety of needed resources. When one or more of these resources is in short supply, growth slows. In addition, living things can only survive and reproduce within a certain range between the upper and the lower limits that they can tolerate for any given critical resource or environmental condition, referred to as their range of tolerance for that factor. The more individual variability there is among members of the population, the wider the range of tolerance might be. Take temperature, for example. Some individuals might tolerate warmer or colder temperatures than others because they were born that way. It is encoded in their genes. Genetic differences that allow some individuals to tolerate or even thrive at the edges of the population's tolerance offer the population a chance to adapt to changing conditions, such as a warmer climate, if needed. The less genetically diverse the population is, the more narrow its range of tolerance and less likely it will survive a change in conditions. Ecologists routinely monitor a variety of limiting factors as a way of assessing ecosystem health, but anticipating what each individual organism would need to survive in Biosphere 2 before the fact proved daunting. A dedicated team of scientists, oceanographers, forest ecologists, plant physiologists, and others spent 2 years sorting through these challenges. Drawing on their combined experience, they set about choosing the combination of soils, plants, and animals that seemed most capable of working together to recreate the delicate balances that had made Biosphere 1 such a spectacular success. And remember, Biosphere 1 refers to the Earth. Each biome was created from a carefully selected array of species. For example, the marsh biome was composed of intact chunks of swampland harvested from the Florida Everglades, and the savanna was composed of grasses from Australia, South America, and Africa. But it wasn't long before the rigor and pragmatism of good science began to clash with the idealism of Biosphere 2 financiers. And when that happened, critics say science lost out. Some scientists worried that the ocean wouldn't get enough sunlight to support plant and animal life. Others opposed the use of soil high in organic matter. Soil microbes decompose soil's organic carbon and release it into the air as CO2. Although this organic soil might eliminate the need for chemical fertilizers, there were concerns that it would provide too much fuel for the soil microbes and would thus send atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations through the roof. Despite these concerns, scientific advisors to the project were overruled. So yeah, remember what I said, always follow the money. The first few months of Mission 1 went smoothly enough, but eventually plants and animals started dying. Humans grew hungry and mysteriously sleepy. Like Earth, Biosphere 2 was designed as a materially closed and energetically open system. Plant growth would be fueled by sunlight that streamed through the glass, but no biomass would enter or leave. Humans would have to survive exclusively on the plants and animals they could grow and harvest under the dome. The system as a whole would have to continuously recycle every last bit of nutrient that was in the soil on day one. At first, the carefully constructed agricultural biome seemed well suited to this challenge. Carrots, broccoli, peanuts, kale, lettuce, and sweet potatoes were grown on broad half-acre terraces that sat adjacent to the sprawling 6-story human habitat. A bevy of domestic animals also provided sustenance: goats for milk, chickens for eggs, and pigs for pork. Indeed, eating only what they could grow made the biospherians healthier. But the glazed glass of the dome admitted less sunlight than had been anticipated. Less sunlight meant less biomass production, and that meant less food. Now, a few months in, food was starting to run out. And that wasn't the only problem. After several months under the dome, the humans grew so tired they couldn't work. Nobody knew why, but scientists on the outside suspected that it had something to do with matter cycles. And that brings us to our infographic number 4 on page 49. Populations have a range of tolerance for any given environmental factor, an upper and a lower limit beyond which it cannot survive. In this example, temperatures are too cool or too hot. Most individuals, like butterflies in this population, can be found around the optimum temperature, although what is quote-unquote optimum for each individual may differ slightly because of genetic variability. These differences expand the range of tolerance for a population as a whole, increasing the potential for it to adapt to changing conditions. And that brings us to our key concept number 5. Carbon cycles through the environment via photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Human actions are increasing the amount of atmospheric carbon, unbalancing this cycle. All organisms need energy to stay alive, to run complicated chemical reactions that allow cells to function. While the sun provides ample energy in the form of sunlight, this is not an energy form readily usable by the cells of all living organisms. It must first be converted to chemical energy, that is, energy held in the chemical bonds of molecules. When those bonds are broken, the energy can be released for use by cells. Life on Earth needs a way to convert abundant solar energy into chemical energy. That process is known as photosynthesis. So using solar energy, plants and other photosynthesizers combine carbon dioxide and water to produce a sugar molecule, and oxygen is a byproduct of this reaction. For terrestrial plants, the most important sink or source of carbon is the atmosphere. Oceans and soil are also abiotic sinks for carbon. Oceans absorb carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, and soils accumulate it during decomposition. Because plants and other photosynthesizers produce sugar, an organic molecule, from inorganic atmospheric carbon dioxide, they are called producers. So this sugar molecule represents stored chemical energy that the producer can use. A consumer, the organism that eats the plant or that eats the organism that eats the plant, also uses the chemical energy of sugar. This energy is released to the cell via cellular respiration, a process in which the sugar molecule is broken down and the energy in the chemical bonds that held the atoms of the molecule together is released. This energy can be captured by cells to run cellular reactions needed by the organism. All organisms, producers and consumers, perform cellular respiration. So, from its initial incorporation into living tissue via photosynthesis to its ultimate return to the atmosphere through cellular respiration, carbon moves in and out of various molecular forms, carbon dioxide or sugar, and in and out of living things as it moves through the carbon cycle. As mentioned earlier, human activity is changing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, unbalancing the carbon cycle. When we burn fossil fuels for energy, we add extra carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. About 25% of this is absorbed by the oceans, and another 25% has been taken up by terrestrial plants due to a boost in photosynthesis. We also add extra carbon dioxide to the atmosphere when we burn large swaths of forest, most often to clear land for agriculture. In addition, deforestation has a net effect of increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide, not just because more is added if the trees are burned, but because we remove the largest photosynthetic organisms on the planet that would be pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, the trees. Class, please be very careful with this statement that I just made about the trees being the largest photosynthetic organisms on the earth. It is a red herring. True, the trees may be large photosynthetic organisms, but not all of the tree photosynthesizes. Only the green parts photosynthesize. So algae can consume more carbon dioxide than trees because it can cover more surface area and grow faster. Again, class, always be skeptical of what you're being told. Use your information and scientific literacies to tease out the truth. So, in Biosphere 2, carbon cycled just like it does on Earth. Carbon moved from living tissue to the atmosphere and back in the same predictable manner. But as the biospherians' energy waned, it became clear that something was going wrong. It turned out that oxygen levels had fallen steadily from 21% down to 14%. At such low concentrations, the Biosphere 2 residents were unable to convert the food they consumed into usable energy. One biospherian said they were just dragging themselves around the place, and also they noted that they had sleep apnea at night. They would wake up gasping for air because their blood chemistry had changed. In just a few months, some 7 tons of oxygen, enough to keep 6 people breathing for 6 months, had gone missing. As scientists from Columbia University later discovered, it had to do with that rich organic soil that the Biosphere 2 planners insisted was used. The abundant soil microbes, the consumers, were gobbling up all of the oxygen and converting it into CO2 as they decomposed the organic matter in the soil. The biospherians responded by filling all unused planting areas with morning glory vines, a pretty and fast-growing species they hoped would maximize the amount of carbon dioxide converted back into oxygen by photosynthesis. But even with an abundance of plants and enough CO2, photosynthesis was still limited by the availability of sunlight. Even the morning glories couldn't keep up with the soil microbes in their warm, well-watered, highly organic soil. Adding to the confusion, concrete used to build parts of Biosphere 2 was absorbing some of the carbon dioxide and converting it into calcium carbonate, trapping some of the carbon and oxygen in this unexpected sink. And that brings us to infographic number 5 on page 52. In photosynthesis, producers use solar energy to combine carbon dioxide and water to make sugar and release oxygen. When an organism, a producer, or any consumer that eats another organism needs energy, it breaks apart the sugar via the reverse reaction, which is cellular respiration. Oxygen is required for this reaction. This is why it is called cellular quote-unquote respiration. Moving on, carbon cycles in and out of living things during photosynthesis and cellular respiration. As consumers eat other organisms, carbon is transferred. Most of Earth's carbon is actually stored in rocks or dissolved in the planet's oceans, but some carbon is stored in the bodies of organisms and in the soil. And that brings us to key concept number 6. Nitrogen is needed by all living things to make biological molecules such as protein and DNA. It continuously moves in and out of organisms and the atmosphere in a cycle dependent on a variety of bacteria. So besides carbon, other chemicals essential for life, such as nitrogen and phosphorus, cycle through ecosystems. Nitrogen, which is the most abundant element in Earth's atmosphere, is needed to make proteins and nucleic acids, but plants cannot utilize nitrogen in its atmospheric form, N2. All plant life, and ultimately all animal life too, depends on microbes or bacteria to convert atmospheric nitrogen into usable forms as part of the nitrogen cycle. In a process called nitrogen fixation, bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, which is NH3. Plants subsequently take up the NH3 through their roots. Consumers take in nitrogen via their diet. Then, in other steps of the nitrogen cycle, different species of bacteria are responsible for nitrification, that is, the conversion of ammonia to nitrate. Nitrate is another form of nitrogen that can be directly used by bacteria or taken up by plants. Still, other bacteria convert nitrate back into molecular nitrogen, which finds its way back into the atmosphere in the process of denitrification. The nitrogen cycle does not operate in isolation. It is closely tied to the carbon cycle. Soil organisms that participate in the nitrogen cycle depend on the sugars produced by plants for their main source of carbon. In return, they provide plants with much needed nitrogen. This is the same relationship that we see with bacteria of the phosphorus cycle. Like the carbon cycle, human impact is also disrupting the nitrogen cycle. In fact, our use of fertilizers, the release of animal or human waste, sewage, into the environment, and vehicle emissions are adding as much fixed nitrogen to the environment as the natural nitrogen cycle does. This is a doubling of the available nitrogen. This excess means nitrogen may no longer be a limiting factor for plant growth, but different plants respond to this in different ways. So the makeup of an ecological community can change with ripple effects felt throughout the ecosystem. And that brings us to infographic number 6 on page 53. Nitrogen is needed by all living things to make biological molecules like protein and DNA. It continuously moves in and out of organisms and the atmosphere in a cycle dependent on a variety of bacteria. And in this next slide, we see that nitrogen fertilizers, animal waste, and sewage promote plant growth, but this can deplete our soil nutrients and pollute aquatic ecosystems. Also, the burning of fossil fuels contributes to nitrogen pollution, such as smog and acid rain. I would also like to point out that nitrates can fall to the ground in raindrops and seep into the soil in a form that can be absorbed by plants. So lightning helps to break loose atmospheric nitrogen from the atmosphere, and as the nitrates dissolve in precipitation, this helps the plants, but still microorganisms in the soil do the vast majority of nitrogen fixation. Furthermore, the biospherians also experience nitrogen cycle disruptions. Thanks to the overabundance of soil microbes in Biosphere 2, levels of nitrous oxide, a normal byproduct of denitrification, got high enough to interfere with vitamin B12 metabolism, affecting the biospherians' nervous systems. And that brings us to key concept number 7. Phosphorus moves slowly through the environment, depending on physical and biological processes. Human impact has also unbalanced this cycle. Moving on, the phosphorus cycle was also disrupted in Biosphere 2. Unlike nitrogen and carbon, phosphorus, which is needed to make important biological molecules like DNA and RNA, is found only in solid or liquid form on Earth. So the phosphorus cycle does not move through the atmosphere. Instead, phosphorus passes from inorganic to organic form through a series of interactions with water and organisms. Like the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle has been disrupted by the release of additional phosphorus into the environment by human activities such as mining, the use of fertilizers, and the release of sewage or animal waste. In Biosphere 2, phosphorus got trapped in the water system, polluting aquatic habitats because the underwater and terrestrial plants there were dying off too quickly to complete this cycle. Biospherians removed excess nutrients from their water supply by passing the water over algal mats that would absorb the phosphorus and could then be harvested, dried, and stored. As food reserves dwindled, the 8 biospherians split into 2 factions. One group felt that scientific research was a top priority and wanted to import food so that they would have enough energy to continue with their experiments. The other group felt that maintaining a truly closed system, that is, one where no biomass was allowed to enter or leave, was the project's most important goal. That faction wanted to show that humans could survive exclusively on what the dome provided. This would be essential to one day colonizing the moon or Mars. To them, importing food would amount to a mission failure. Well, I think this gives us a great opportunity for our discussion on the process of science. The whole idea behind the Biosphere 2 project was to have humans living in this closed system. They had set out the guidelines before they went into the Biosphere 2 dome. So to me, importing materials goes against the scientific process. It is not good science to change the variables midstream. It's not a good experiment. Your book goes on to point out that one of the biospherians snuck in food. That's a total breach of the protocol for the experiment. Bad science. They should have let the experiment run its course. Then, when it didn't work, change the hypothesis and start over. Don't change it midstream. It's bad science. The book also points out that the project's engineers installed a CO2 scrubber and pumped in some 4 million gallons of oxygen. I would have done it completely different. I would have pulled out the biospherians when the oxygen levels or the food levels got to the point where they were going to die. So this Biosphere 2 project costed, on the low end, $200 million. And as I always say, follow the money. I would wager there were some politics behind this, not only inside of the Biosphere 2, but also on the outside. The people investing in this project did not want to lose their investment, so when it started to not work, they tried to change the game. And that's what we see frequently in science these days, is people with money want a certain result. They will do practically anything, including changing how the experiment is being conducted midstream. And it's just bad science, no matter how much money is involved. Science is supposed to be about truth, not about money. The book goes on to point out that 3 years after the first mission was completed, the editors of the respected journal Science deemed the entire project a failure. The journal said, quote, Isolating small pieces of large biomes and juxtaposing them in an artificial enclosure changed their functioning and interactions rather than creating a small working Earth as originally intended, unquote. So I would agree that the project is a failure, but for a different reason than science. As soon as the biospherians started to sneak in food, and when the project engineers installed the carbon scrubber, to me, that's the failure. So not only did this Biosphere 2 project fail in the respect that it did not work physically, but it also failed in the process of science. And to me, that's the biggest failure, the failure in the process of science. Because remember, negative results can be just as informative as positive ones. In some cases, even more so, because they uncover gaps in our knowledge and help us to decide how to move forward. My graduate advisor always said that the pathway to success is failure. It can also be said that the pathway to failure is success. The Biosphere 2 project taught scientists that Earth is an exceptionally complex and dynamic place. And I think that's kind of obvious. Even without the Biosphere 2 project, I think we know that. Ecosystem components intertwine and respond to one another in many complicated ways. Each is governed by a countless array of interacting factors, and a change in one can set off a whole chain of events that degrade the system's capacity to sustain life. This complexity will make it difficult, if not impossible, for humans to recreate a fully functional and self-sustaining biosphere habitat capable of supporting human life long term. So one of Biosphere 2's greatest liabilities was its skyrocketing carbon dioxide levels. And this is proving to be a valuable asset. Biosphere 2 is allowing us to look at the consequences of elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Some scientists believe that this is the main contributor to climate change today. And remember, the Earth's climate is constantly changing. Recent research has uncovered some of the complexities of carbon cycling. Unexpected fluctuations in carbon released at various levels in the tree canopy is telling. There is much we still don't know about how carbon cycles. Data that could only be gathered in an enclosed forest such as that found in Biosphere 2. Today, school groups and tourists can visit Biosphere 2, and scientists from all over the world still use the facility to study a variety of research topics at scales not possible outside of the facility. For example, the ambitious Landscape Evolution Observatory project has constructed 3 large identical artificial landscapes that will allow scientists to precisely monitor how these landscapes change over time as climate parameters such as temperature, humidity, and wind speed are manipulated. The triplicate landscapes allow researchers to assess inherent variability in the complex process of landscape evolution. Ultimately, though, the most valuable lesson Biosphere 2 has provided might just be how irreplaceable Biosphere 1 is. And that brings us to our infographic number 7 on page 54. Phosphorus is needed by all organisms to make DNA. It cycles very slowly, and it has no atmospheric component, but instead it depends on the weathering of rock to release new supplies of phosphate into bodies of water or soil, where it dissolves in water and can be taken up by organisms. Microbes also play a role when they break down organic material and release the phosphate into the soil. Moving on, dust released through mining or eroded areas can introduce phosphorus into the environment much more quickly than it would normally enter. And fertilizers and animal wastes, including sewage, can alter plant growth and nutrient cycling, especially in aquatic ecosystems where phosphorus is usually a limiting nutrient. And that brings us to our core message. Ecosystems are complex assemblages of many interacting living and non-living components. Living organisms play irreplaceable roles in nature, supporting life and allowing ecosystems to function over the long term. It is important that we protect ecosystems and work to restore damaged areas to keep these connections intact so that we and other species can continue to live and thrive on this planet. So in summary, I would just like to say that many people labeled the Biosphere 2 project a failure. However, in science, just as much can be learned from failure as it can from success. Biosphere 2 is allowing us to look at the consequences of elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide levels